The rain hadn't stopped for days. Cold, heavy, and endless, it soaked through cloaks, rusted armor, and brought a sick smell to the camps along the Green Fork. Robb Stark sat inside his tent, hunched over a table, maps laid out in front of him. The candle flickered, casting long shadows, but his mind was clear. "They're not to be trusted," Catelyn Stark had warned, her voice tight with worry. "Lord Walder Frey is no friend. He's old, proud, and holds too many grudges. He'll smile at you and poison your cup the same night." Robb looked up, meeting his mother's eyes. "Then why should we ask him for passage at all?" Catelyn hesitated. "Because we must cross the Twins. If you march all the way around, you lose weeks, time we don't have. Your grandfather's army won't hold River Run forever." But Robb had been thinking for days now. Walder Frey had sent no help when the North called its banners. His sons were cowards. His keep was full of whispers and knives. If they bowed to the Freys now, they would forever owe them something, and Robb Stark didn't want to owe anyone, especially not a man like Walder. "No," he said at last. "We won't beg. We'll take it." Catelyn stared at her son, searching his face. She saw not just the boy she'd raised, but the man he'd become. "Then you'd best strike fast. He has 10 sons, dozens of grandsons, and more men behind his walls than you think." 3 nights later, under cover of the storm, Robb moved. The Twins loomed on both sides of the river, towers of grey stone lit by only a few flickering torches. Robb's scouts had done well. One of the towers had a weakness, a forgotten sally port in the east wall, half covered by vines known only to older soldiers. It would be their way in. Great John Umber grinned as he rode beside Robb. "About bloody time. I never liked the idea of kissing old Walder's bony hand just across a bridge." "We'll strike at dawn," Robb said, rain dripping down his face. "Silent, fast, and without mercy. The Freys will either open their gates or we'll open them ourselves." As dawn broke, Robb's army moved like a ghost in the fog. Archers crept through the wet grass, swords drawn, breath held. The sallyport groaned as it opened, and 10 of Robb's best fighters slipped inside, blades ready. The fighting began with screams. It was quick and brutal. Frey guards were caught half asleep, stumbling in confusion, cut down before they could even raise alarms. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, the eastern tower was in Stark hands. Trumpets sounded. The western tower raised its banners in panic. Lord Walder Frey stood in the great hall of his tower, his wrinkled face pale with fear. "They wouldn't dare," he whispered. "I'm their only way across." But Robb had already crossed by force. By midday, the bridges of the Twins were seized. Frey soldiers who surrendered were bound and locked away. Those who resisted met northern steel. Robb Stark stood on the bridge, his cloak stained with blood and rain, the banners of House Stark flying high. His men cheered. The boy they'd followed south was now a wolf in full. When Catelyn joined him on the bridge, she looked out at the river, then at the towers behind them. "You've done what no Stark ever dared," she said quietly. "And we'll keep moving," Robb answered. "No more delays. River Run still stands for now." But even as they prepared to march, word spread like wildfire through the riverlands. Robb Stark had attacked the Freys. The North would remember it as bold. Others would see it as madness. Walder Frey, locked in his tower, stared out at the banners of the wolf and swore vengeance in his heart. He would bide his time. He had lost this battle, but the game was not over. Not yet. And far to the south, in King's Landing, whispers reached Tywin Lannister. "The boy king grows teeth," he muttered. "Good. Let him bite. He'll choke on the lion's tail." The war had changed that day. The North no longer begged for paths. It carved them open with fire and blood. The mud was thick on the Riverland's roads. Each step the horses took made a sick squelch, and the wheels of the supply carts groaned as they dragged through the soaked earth. Robb Stark rode at the head of his army, his direwolf, Grey Wind, pacing silently at his side, his yellow eyes watchful. They had taken the twins, but the cost wasn't gold or blood alone. News of the attack spread fast. Lords who once considered joining Robb now hesitated. Some feared his boldness, others hated him for it. The Freys, for all their cowardice, had many ties, marriages, pacts, debts. Robb had broken a wall that had long held the Riverlands together. "Some call you a hero," Sir Edmure Tully said when Robb's army reached the outskirts of River Run. "Others say you've doomed us all." Robb dismounted, mud crusting his boots. His uncle looked tired, his beard streaked with grey, his armor dented and worn. The siege had lasted weeks. "I didn't come for praise," Robb said, scanning the field. "How many men do you have left?" "Not enough. We hold the castle, but barely. The Lannisters press from the east. Sir Gregor Clegane has burned 3 villages nearby. Their bleeding is slow, cutting food supplies. Then we strike first," Robb said without hesitation. "We've waited too long already." But the camp was uneasy. At night, by the fires, the lords spoke in whispers. Roose Bolton, always quiet, warned Robb of the path he had chosen. "You've made yourself a king without a crown," Bolton said, his eyes like 2 dead stones. "But kings make enemies fast. Lord Walder won't forget the insult. He may be old, but he has sons, daughters, and enough spite to poison a river." Robb stared into the flames. "I'd rather be hated for what I've done than beg for permission like a coward." Rose gave a faint smile. "Then let's hope your sword stays sharp longer than their memories." The next day, the Stark host clashed with Lannister scouts in the woods near River Run. It wasn't a battle, it was a message. Robb fought from the front, Grey Wind tearing through red-cloaked men like a shadow. The Northern army was full of fire, their morale high after the twins. They were no longer marching, they were hunting. One prisoner survived the ambush, a young Lannister squire, pale and trembling. Robb had him brought to the center of camp. "What's your name?" he asked, voice low. "Joss Hill, my lord." "Joss Hill, my lord? I mean, your grace." "Who commands the siege at River Run?" "Sir Adam Marbrand, and Sir Forley Prester holds the supply lines." Robb glanced at Roose Bolton, who gave a silent nod. The boy wasn't lying. "Tell them this," Robb said, stepping closer, his eyes cold. "Tell them the North has come, and we're not here to play war. We're here to end it. Surrender River Run, or I'll stack your commanders' heads like stones on the banks of the Trident." The squire was let go. Some lords thought it was mercy, others saw it as strategy. Either way, the Lannisters would know now they weren't facing a green boy. They were facing a wolf. Inside River Run, Lord Hoster Tully lay dying. Catelyn sat beside her father, holding his frail hand. He coughed blood, his eyes watery, but he still clung to the world. "He has your father's fire," Hoster rasped. "Robb, he's more wolf than man now." "He's doing what he must," Catelyn whispered, brushing his hair back. "But I worry what the cost will be. He's starting to believe he's invincible." "That's how kings fall," Hoster said with a faint smile, "just before they learn they bleed like anyone else." Outside, horns blew. The Lannisters were preparing for another assault, but this time Robb Stark wasn't trapped in the castle. He was charging out of the woods like a storm. The siege of River Run would not end in surrender. It would end in fire, steel, and screams echoing through the Riverlands. And from the shadows, unseen and quiet, Lord Walder Frey received a raven. The note he read made his lips curl into a crooked smile. "The boy's drawn blood," he muttered, crumpling the parchment. "Good. Now let's see how much he's willing to bleed in return." Rain returned with a vengeance. It fell like punishment from the gods, soaking the earth, choking the breath out of the wounded, and turning the battlefield outside River Run into a swamp of blood and broken men. But Robb Stark didn't flinch. He rode through the storm, shouting orders as steel clashed and arrows screamed through the air. The Lannisters had not expected the North to fight with such fury. Robb's plan was bold some, would later say, reckless. Instead of waiting behind walls, he attacked from the outside. His men came from the forests, from the hills, and from the river itself, striking the siege camps like wolves among sheep. Sir Adam Marbrand, proud and well-trained, was caught off guard. Robb himself led the charge on the western flank. With Grey Wind by his side and the Great John roaring at his back, they cut through the enemy lines like fire through dry grass. "Push them back!" Robb shouted, his sword dripping crimson. "Show them what the North remembers." Grey Wind lunged, dragging a knight from his horse and tearing into his throat. Around them, stark bannermen howled with ragemen who had lost sons and daughters to Lannister raids, men whose families had burned when Tywin Lannister's men torched the Riverlands. They weren't just fighting for victory, they were fighting for vengeance. Inside the castle, Catelyn Stark stood on the battlements, watching the chaos below. Rain soaked her hair, but she didn't care. She saw her son, her boy, riding like a seasoned warrior, fearless and wild. "He's winning," Edmure said beside her, stunned. But Catelyn didn't smile. "Yes," she said softly, "but each time he wins, the war demands more of him." Across the field, Sir Adan tried to rally what was left of his cavalry. The Lannister horns blew retreat, but the North gave no mercy. Archers fired without pause. Roose Bolton's riders struck the rear flank, silent and cold, their blades cutting down the wounded as they fled. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, the siege was over. River Run was free, but the cost was clear. Bodies lay scattered across the muddy fields Northmen, Lannisters, horses, and broken banners. The air smelled of blood and smoke. And far away, a raven took flight from the towers of River Run, carrying news of Robb Stark's second victory. In King's Landing, Tywin Lannister read the raven's message in silence. The room was quiet only. The crackling of the hearth filled the air. So the boy had taken the twins. And now he had broken the siege of River Run. Tywin folded the letter slowly, his gold-ringed fingers steady. "He's not a boy anymore," he muttered. "He's a problem." Kevan Lannister stood nearby, uneasy. "Should we reinforce Harrenhal? If he marches south?" "He won't," Tywin cut in. "Not yet. He'll feel strong now. Kings always do when they're wet with blood. But he's won 2 major battles, and made twice as many enemies in the process," Tywin said coldly. "The Freys won't forget what he did. Neither will the Riverlords who relied on those bridges for trade. He's surrounded by men who cheer when he wins, but will curse him the moment he stumbles." He stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the Red Keep. "Let the wolf think he's winning," he said darkly. "Let him roar. The louder he gets, the more ears he'll draw, and not all will be friendly." Back at River Run, the mood was half celebration, half unease. The lords of the Riverlands gathered in the great hall to feast and drink, but many wore forced smiles. Some glanced at Robb with admiration, others with fear. Lord Jason Mallister, flushed with wine, raised a cup. "To the king in the north, may the lions piss themselves next time." Roars of approval followed, but Roose Bolton remained silent, eyes sharp. Robb sat at the head of the table, a crownless king in a muddy cloak, his sword resting beside his plate. He barely touched his food. His mind was elsewhere. "We need to move again soon," he told Catelyn quietly. "We can't sit and celebrate while the Lannisters regroup." "You need rest, Robb," she urged. "Your men do too." "We'll rest when we've won," he said, his voice hard. But even as he spoke, a shadow crept over the room. Lord Walder Frey had sent a letter. It was short, cold, barely hiding his rage. "You took my bridge. You spilled my blood. We'll speak of debt one day, boy." Robb read it in silence and smiled. "Let him come," he muttered. "I'm done asking for permission." But in the dark, Catelyn felt something shift. The war wasn't just being fought on fields anymore. It was moving into halls, into letters, into beds and banquets and betrayal. And the wolf, for all his teeth, could still be hunted. It was the quiet after victory that felt most dangerous. Riverrun's walls stood tall again, its gates sealed, and the Lannisters gone from its shadow. But in the silence that followed, unease crept like a sickness. Robb Stark paced the stone halls, grey wind at his heels, growling softly at every unfamiliar scent. The young king had won 2 battles, but peace had made him restless. "You're not sleeping," Catelyn said one morning, watching her son from across the room. He stood by the window, staring at the fields where corpses had only just been cleared. "There's no time for sleep," Robb muttered. "We've stirred a hornet's nest. The Lannisters will return, stronger. Tywin doesn't lose twice without planning a 3rd strike 10 times harder." Catelyn approached, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then you must be ready for it. And not just with swords. You need allies. True ones, not just banners, houses who will stand with you when the fire comes again." Robb turned. "And who's left to trust?" "House Tyrell," she said firmly. "They're rich, vast armies, and they hate the Lannisters more than we do." Robb raised an eyebrow. "You want me to marry a Rose?" Catelyn didn't flinch. "You've already made enemies of the Freys. That bridge you took cost us more than just soldiers. It cost us trust. Forget it. You need something greater now. A marriage that binds you to power." Robb sighed, running a hand through his soaped curls. "So I sell myself off like a pawn?" "No," she said gently. "You become a king worth fearing." Ravens flew within the week, one to Highgarden, another to White Harbour, a third to the Vale, though they were still too proud to answer. In Highgarden, Lady Olenna Tyrell read Robb Stark's letter with an amused smirk. "The young wolf grows teeth and suddenly wants a rose to soothe them," she said. "How romantic, how foolish." But Marjorie Tyrell, sitting beside her grandmother, had already begun to smile. "Perhaps not foolish," she whispered. "Perhaps necessary." And while Tyrells whispered of unions and opportunity, Walder Frey sat in silence in the cold halls of the twins, staring at the corner where the Stark bannerman had spilled Frey blood. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten, but he remembered. Back at Riverrun, Robb met with his council in the war room. Around him sat men he trusted less and less with every passing day. Roose Bolton spoke first. "We've won battles, but the war drags on. Winter is coming, and the men grow weary. You must give them something to believe in. Victory is what they believe in," Robb said flatly. "A crown is not enough," Roose said with his usual chill. "You need a future, an heir, a queen." Robb's jaw tightened. "I know what I must do, but I'll choose whom I marry, not some stranger for the sake of numbers." "Then choose soon," Roose said, "before someone chooses for you." As if summoned by fate, the doors opened, and Talisa Maegare walked in. She was dressed in healer's robes, her hands still stained with blood from treating wounded soldiers. Her dark eyes met Robb's across the room, and in them was something that silenced him: honesty, strength, and danger. Later that night, when the hall was empty, she found him alone. "You're a king now," she said softly, "but you still walk like the boy who left Winterfell." Robb laughed bitterly. "That boy made fewer enemies." "And yet," she said, stepping closer, "you never seemed more alive than you do now." Their kiss was inevitable. So was the mistake. Catelyn Stark knew before he told her. A mother always knows. She saw it in his eyes the next morning. The guilt, the decision. "You married her," she whispered. Robb didn't answer. "You defied your bannermen. You spat in the face of the Freys again." "I followed my heart," he said. "You followed weakness," Catelyn snapped. "And now you've given Lord Walder something far worse than insult. You've given him a reason." Robb looked away. In the cold silence, a storm brewed far away, not of wind or snow, but of knives, wine, and vengeance. At the twins, Lord Walder read the Raven in silence. So the boy had broken his oath. He had taken the bridge, spilled Frey blood, and now, Insult of insults, he had married a foreign nobody instead of one of his daughters. Walder Frey smiled, slow and cruel. "I'll send him an invitation," he said. "Let's see if the young wolf comes to feast with those he shamed." And in the corner, Roose Bolton's eyes flickered just once. A quiet, dark beginning. The invitation arrived wrapped in silk and lies. A Frey rider rode into Riverrun under a banner of peace, his horse clean, his armor polished, his smile thin. He handed the letter to Robb Stark with a deep bow, as if nothing had ever happened on the bridges of the twins, as if Frey blood had not soaked the stones, as if the past could be washed away with pretty words. Robb broke the seal and read in silence. Catelyn watched his face harden. "A wedding," Robb said at last. "One of Lord Walder's granddaughters. He invites us to make peace. Bread and salt. Apologies." Laughter. Catelyn's heart sank. "It's a trap. Everything is a trap," Robb replied. "That doesn't mean we stop moving." "He hates you," she said sharply. "You humiliated him, took his bridge, killed his men, and broke your marriage pact." "I know," Robb said. "That's exactly why I must go." The room fell silent. Roose Bolton leaned forward, fingers steepled. "It would look weak to refuse. The River Lords are watching. If you reject the Freys now, some will fear you, others will abandon you." "And if I go?" Robb asked. Roose smiled faintly. "Then you show courage or arrogance. History decides which." Catelyn stood. "I won't let you walk into a slaughter." Robb met her gaze. "I won't walk in blind. I'll bring guards. The Greatjon, my dire wolf. If Walder Frey wants to betray me under guest-right, he'll damn himself forever." Catelyn almost laughed. Forever meant little to men like Walder Frey. The twins looked the same as ever. Grey stone, narrow bridges, towers like watching eyes. But Catelyn felt it in her bones. Something was wrong. The banners were raised too neatly. The guards smiled too quickly. Music drifted from the halls, loud and forced. "Too much wine," Catelyn whispered to Robb as they crossed the bridge. "Too much noise." "They want us comfortable," Robb said. "That's when people are easiest to kill." Inside, Lord Walder Frey waited, perched on his chair like a spider in a web. He smiled, wide and fake. "Your Grace," he croaked, "the young wolf returns to my humble home. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten me." "I never forget debts," Robb replied calmly. Walder chuckled. "Good. Then tonight we forgive them." Bread and salt were brought. Catelyn watched Robb eat, her hands trembling. Once guest right was given, betrayal would be an unforgivable sin. Unless the Freys had already decided they no longer feared the gods. The feast began. Music played. Cups overflowed. Frey daughters laughed too loudly. Frey sons stared too long. Talisa sat beside Robb, uneasy but composed. Grey Wind was kept outside the hall, Walder had insisted. That alone made Catelyn's stomach twist. As the night wore on, the doors closed, one by one, quietly. Catelyn noticed first. "Robb," she whispered. The music changed. The drums slowed, then stopped. The first crossbow bolt flew. It missed Robb by inches, striking a Stark bannerman in the throat. Blood sprayed across the table. Screams erupted. Steel rang out. "Treachery!" The Greatjon roared, overturning a table as bolts slammed into his chest. He went down, still fighting, axes swinging. Robb drew his sword instantly, pulling Talisa behind him. To the doors! But the doors were barred. Frey soldiers poured in from side halls, faces twisted, eyes burning with hatred. Crossbows reloaded. More bolts flew. Catelyn grabbed a dagger from a fallen guard and lunged for Walder Frey. "This ends now!" But she was seized before she reached him. Walder leaned forward, smiling. "You should have stayed north, my lady. You wolves never learned your place." Robb fought like a demon. He cut down 3 men, then 4. blood soaked his cloak. He screamed orders that went unheard. Northern men fell around him, trapped, butchered. Then Talisa screamed. Robb turned just in time to see a Frey spear pierce her side. "No!" he shouted, catching her as she fell. Blood poured through his fingers. Crossbows lifted again. Catelyn's scream tore through the hall as the bolts flew. The music started again, slow, mocking. Outside, Grey Wind howled. Inside, the young wolf fell to his knees, clutching the woman he loved, surrounded by the dead dreams of a kingdom. Lord Walder Frey watched it all with quiet satisfaction. "The debt is paid," he whispered. But even as the hall filled with death, one truth lingered in the air, heavy and dangerous. This betrayal was louder than the last, and the North would not forget. The twins were quiet the next morning, too quiet. The next morning, blood still stained the stone floors. The feasting hall smelled of smoke and death. Bodies were dragged into wagons, Stark men, Frey men, even a few innocent servants who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Lord Walder Frey stood at the top of the tower, staring down at the carnage with a smirk that barely twitched. "The young wolf is dead," he told his sons, "and the North will crawl now. They'll come begging on broken knees." But even he didn't sound fully convinced, because something had changed. The Stark army hadn't just lost its king, it had been butchered under guest right, and worse, it was no secret. Walder's men had laughed, shouted, cheered as they murdered under the rules of peace. The gods themselves had been insulted, and the Riverlands watched. In the days that followed, no songs were sung, no one toasted victory. Instead, they waited, because something was coming. Far to the north in Winterfell's ruins, the snow was falling heavier than ever. Small folk whispered of the massacre at the Twins. Even the Ironborn occupying the castle grew uneasy. One night, a northern farmer slipped past the gates with a simple message scrawled on sheepskin. "The wolf is dead, but his howl still carries." At White Harbor, Lord Wyman Manderley read the Raven with shaking hands. His son, Willis, had died at the Twins. "Guessed right," he muttered over and over, eyes wild, wine forgotten in his hand. "Guessed right, under the roof of the gods." His maester tried to speak, but Manderley slammed a hand on the table. "No," he said, "no more diplomacy. No more kneeling to lions or rats. Fetch the smiths. Every blade in this city will be sharpened." He stood, voice cold. "The North remembers." Roose Bolton rode from the Twins 2 days after the slaughter, silent and satisfied. His part had been played perfectly. He had said nothing, done little, but when the blades flew, he did not raise his own, and for that he was rewarded. Lord Walder had whispered it that night, his breath smelling of sour wine. "Tell Lord Tywin, the North is yours now. My bridges are yours. Just make sure someone wears the crown who knows how to kneel." And Roose Bolton had smiled, not because he liked Walder, but because he had bigger plans. The bastard he had left in the North Ramsay snow was already seizing castles in the chaos. The flayed man would rise while the wolves bled. And with the Starks shattered, Roose's name could be next to where the North. But the Freys had made one mistake. They didn't kill everyone. A handful of Robb's men had escaped in the madness, bloody, broken, and burning with vengeance. One of them was Mage Mormont, her face scarred, her arms split open. She limped north through the Riverlands, hiding by day, hunting by night. Another was Small John Imber, half-mad with grief, vowing to kill every Frey from the bottom up. And among the silent survivors was a boy named Martin Castle. Just 16, he had watched his father die at the Twin. He had seen Grey Wind's body riddled with bolts. He had pulled a Frey dagger from his own side and crawled under corpses to escape. And now Martin carried something more dangerous than any sword, a name. Martin carried something more dangerous than any sword, a name. The name of every Frey who had raised a hand in that hall, every Lannister who had planned it, every lord who had stayed silent. a list. He would carry it north, and one day someone would read it. Someone would answer. In King's Landing, Tywin Lannister received Walder's raven and smiled the coldest smile in Westeros. "The wolf is dead," he said. Tyrion frowned. "You should be pleased. You don't sound it." Tywin didn't look up, because killing him wasn't the real war. Controlling what comes after is. He rose from his seat, walking to the window. "They'll remember this moment not as our triumph, but as our crime." Tyrion drained his wine. "And what happens when the North stops mourning and starts sharpening its swords?" Tywin paused, just for a moment. "Then we'll cross that bridge when they rebuild it." But even he knew, deep down, that no gold, no sword, no alliance could hold back what was coming, because the North didn't forget. And wolves don't die in silence. The snows came early that year, thick, blinding, and endless, as if the North itself was mourning. Villages in the hills vanished beneath the white. Roads froze. Even the wolves stopped howling. But beneath the snow, something stirred. It began as whispers, then ravens, then fire. House Frey had killed the young wolf, but they hadn't killed his memory, and that memory was sharpening teeth. Deep in the wolf's wood, 5 riders gathered around a fire, cloaks soaked, faces hidden, blades cold. Among them sat Maeg Mormont, her broken arm now bound in boiled leather. "Name the next one," she growled. Martin Castle, his face still pale with old blood, unrolled the scroll. "Sir Simond Frey." He laughed when they killed Robb's direwolf. "Cut the beast's head off himself." Mage spat into the fire. "Then resend his head back with the same blade." The others nodded. No war horns, no banners. This wasn't war, it was vengeance. The next night, Sir Simond was found hanging from his own tower at Seaguard, his tongue cut out, his eyes gouged. Nailed to his chest was a piece of parchment marked with a single word, Geist. By the time the 3rd Frey lord was found poisoned in a brothel, House Frey began to panic. They doubled their guards, barred their gates, called for help from the Lannisters. But no help came. Even the Red Keep had grown quiet, because now Tywin's crime was haunting his throne. In White Harbor, Lord Wyman Manderley feigned grief and diplomacy, but behind closed doors he was feeding information to the survivors. He sheltered Martin Castle and sent forged letters on Frey parchment, drawing enemies into traps. He even began construction on a ship called The North Remembers a War Galley, hidden under the pretense of trade. To the world, Manderley was old and fat, but to the North, he was dangerous, and he wasn't alone. In the shadows of the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton received reports with growing unease. The Freys were dying, quietly, one by one, sometimes alone, sometimes with their families. Always in ways that mocked the Red Wedding. One was found drowned in his own wine barrel. Another had his throat cut during a feast in front of 40 men who didn't see anything. And all across the Riverlands, Stark loyalists began rising from the ashes. The Karstarks, though torn, began rallying again. The Umbers sent scouts into the Neck. The Blackwoods fortified their woods. And in the north, the small folk forgotten, hungry, scattered, were gathering around fires to tell the story. The boy king is dead, but his spirit rides. In a ruined mill near the Neck, a man with cold blue eyes met with Maeg Mormont. His face was clean, his armor well kept, his hands calloused from war. "How many have you killed?" he asked. 7, Maeg answered. 3 Freys, 2 Lannister envoys, 1 maester who sent the raven, and 1 traitor from our own. The man nodded. "And how many more?" "As many as it takes." He pulled back his cloak. The direwolf of House Stark gleamed on his breastplate. "We ride for the twins tomorrow," he said. "There's a wedding being held for a Frey cousin. Quiet. No banners." Maeg smiled. "Let's make it quieter." At the twins, Walder Frey grew paranoid. Servants vanished. Food was tested by tasters. Every shadow made him flinch. Even his sons stopped trusting one another. He tried to send a raven to Tywin. No reply. He summoned Roose Bolton, but Roose had other plans. A letter arrived instead, written in Roose's cold, deliberate hand. "You fed the fire. Let it burn." Lord Bolton, Walder, cursed, screamed, threatened to flay his own maesters. But it didn't matter. He was surrounded by enemies with his own last name. One night, thunder cracked above the twins. The wedding feast was held in the lower hall. Dozens of Freys, drinking, laughing, pretending they were still feared. Until the doors burst open. Arrows flew from the shadows, knives in wine, sword from cloak. Screams echoed like ghosts. Maegay Mormont led the charge, her broken arm strapped to her side, her axe red with blood. For the king in the north, she roared. And that night, a dozen more Freys died. By morning, their banners were burned, their bridge painted with blood. No one claimed responsibility. No one left a name. But carved into the stone beside the feast hall was a single phrase: "The North remembers." And from the Vale to the Wall, from frostbitten hills to broken castles, that phrase echoed louder than any war horn. Robb Stark was dead, but something far more dangerous had risen in his place. A people who had lost their king and found their fury. Winter had settled over the north like a clenched fist. Snow buried roads, blanketed ruins, and howled through mountain passes like a restless ghost. Yet beneath that frozen silence, the north was moving, not with banners, not with songs, but with blades in the dark and rage that no storm could smother. House Frey was crumbling. By the end of the year, 32 Freys had been found dead. Some drowned in their sleep. Some never made it to their wedding beds. One had his eyes sewn shut with wolf hair. Another had a dire wolf's skull nailed to his door with a note, "For the pack." And at the center of it all, unseen, unnamed, was the vengeance of the North. It had no leader, no lord, no face. It was not an army. It was a reckoning. Deep in the crypts of Winterfell, Jon Snow stood before the tomb of Ned Stark. The fire in his hand flickered in the cold air. He hadn't spoken for hours. When he did, it was a whisper. They killed him like an animal. Ghost stood beside him, still as death. Jon's voice shook, not from cold. They slaughtered Mother, Greywind, Talisa, even the men who followed him, and they did it laughing. He placed a hand on his father's stone. I never got to fight beside him. Behind him, the voice of Davos Seaworth echoed through the crypt. You might still fight for him. Jon turned. The North is rising, Davos said softly. The Freys are bleeding. The Boltons are losing hold. But they need a name, a banner. They need someone to unite them. I'm not Robb, Jon said flatly. No, Davos replied. You're not, but maybe that's why they'll follow you. In White Harbor, Lord Wyman Manderley hosted a feast. Oysters, lamprey pie, honeyed wine. But behind every toast was quiet planning. Lords who had once stayed quiet now leaned in closer. Stannis is south, but slow, Manderley said. The Boltons sit in Winterfell, but they're no kings. The Freys, their days are numbered. He raised a cup, but the North has one advantage. Lady Barbary Dustin narrowed her eyes. And what's that? Memory. He drank. We remember the boy they murdered, the king they betrayed, and we remember what it means to kneel to cowards. The hall roared. Roose Bolton sat in the great hall of Winterfell, colder than the stones around him. Ravens brought news that tasted like poison. Another Frey dead. Another village refusing taxes. A Karstark ship sunk in the White Knife. Bolton men found flayed with their own banner stuffed in their mouths. And worse, Jon Snow's name had started to spread, not as Lord Commander, not as a bastard, but as the White Wolf. Roose stared into the fire. They want another Stark, he muttered, even if they have to make one. His bastard son Ramsay laughed from the shadows. Let them try. But Roose didn't laugh. He knew the North, and he knew vengeance when it wore a familiar face. At Castle Black, Jon stood before the men who had once called him brother. "I'm going south," he said simply. Tormund Giantsbane grunted. "Good, you've got fire in you again." Sam, writing furiously, paused. "The Night's Watch, I've given everything to the Wall," Jon interrupted. "Now I give something to the North." He looked beyond the gates. "I was born a bastard. I'll die a wolf." And with Ghost by his side he rode. It happened fast after that. Barrington rose first. The Dustins swore fealty to the wolf in the snow. Then Deepwood Mott. Then the Risewells. Even parts of House Reed began sending scouts into the Neck, clearing the swamps of Freys stragglers. By the time Jon reached the outskirts of Winterfell, over 3,000 men followed him. But this wouldn't be a siege. It would be a purge. The Battle of Winterfell lasted less than a day. Jon's army struck from 3 sides at dawn, using the old hunter paths. Wyman Manderly's men came from the east, the Umbers from the west, and Jon himself rode straight through the middle on a pale horse, Ghost tearing through the gates beside him. Roose Bolton died with a sword in his gut and his mouth full of blood. Ramsay was hunted like a dog and vanished into the snow, some say eaten by his own hounds. Others say worse. By dusk, Winterfell belonged to the wolves again, and the Stark banner flew once more. In the Godswood, Jon stood before the heart tree. Snow fell like ash. "They killed Robb to break us," he said quietly. "But they only made us remember." Behind him, the lords of the North gathered, Mage Mormont, Wyman Manderly, the great Jon's heir, men who had bled for the Starks, women who had buried sons for the cause, and from all corners of the circle, one chant began to rise. The king in the north, the White Wolf. Stark, far away, at the crumbling walls of the Twins, an old man sat alone. Walder Frey, blind in one eye, rotting in his chair, heard the whispers in the hall. Jon Snow had taken Winterfell, that crowned another wolf, and this time they would not stop at bridges. They would bring the whole house down, and this time the North would remember everything.